hello everybody, and I see my friend Echo Noble out there. I haven't seen you in so long. Nice to see you. So I don't always see everyone, just so you know that I only see who comes in first, apparently. And then I have to put on my reading glasses actually to see your names and to see you really well. So I have decided not to generally lean forward and do that because it disrupts the conversational feeling of this. So I'm so happy that you're here today and that you've taken time away from the holiday weekend to talk about a topic that is not necessarily a popular topic. I know that from having had lots and lots of conversations about this particular topic. So I want to say, before I get into just a summary of why I wanted to have this conversation, that I am open to any and all questions. I know I had a little bit of a question that came through even before the class. So the reason I wanted to have this conversation was in part because I know that in mindfulness communities and in Buddhist communities, there have been lots of problems. I know that. And so I'm open to talking about those problems. In fact, I think that if we don't talk about them and really ask authentic questions, then, excuse me, then we're not doing our part to contribute to the development of Dharma in the West. Because here in the West, our relationships with our teachers and with our fellow students are really quite different from the relationships that have traditionally been in Asian societies where Buddhism has been practiced. Now, I do know from my dear friend Bill Waldron, who's a professor of Buddhist studies at Middlebury and who goes to Nepal 6 months of every year to teach Buddhism in Nepal, that the effects of Western Buddhism have come to Asia now. And so he is often teaching Buddhism from a Western perspective to Asian students who have some of the same kinds of questions and concerns that Westerners have now about equality, about rights of individuals, about the hierarchy, and lots of other things. So the short sense of this is, please ask any questions. Don't be embarrassed or afraid to say whatever you want to say about the topic. So that's kind of the caveat or the welcome. So then, you know, one reason why I feel that this is such an important topic is that when I taught at the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute a year ago, or maybe it was now going to be 2 years ago, I guess in the summer, what I noticed is that there was a lot of debate around the issues of social justice and also environmental justice. And of course, the topic of the Summer Research Institute was about the individual and culture, or cultural and social and racial differences. And so, you know, it was fair game. There was a lot of conversation. But the conversation, even in the environment of Mind and Life Institute, which is, of course, sponsored and founded by the Dalai Lama and his foundation, and there was a representative from his foundation, the conversation lacked an understanding of the ethical precepts that are the foundation for Buddhist practice. There were a lot of people there who had not taken those precepts, who had not taken the refuge vows. And it became difficult for me sometimes to find a way to enter into the conversation because of the precise kinds of vows that we take when we actually come onto the Buddhist path. Now, those vows also are given in a different framework than, say, something like the Ten Commandments. But they do provide a foundation and a framing for everything that we do in terms of practice and in terms of, that is meditation practice, formal practice, and in terms of the way that we guide ourselves in the world. So that's one aspect, is mindfulness without those ethical foundations just looks different than with those foundations. And we could get into conversation about that through questions if you'd like to do that. Then another issue is the worldview that is the actual foundation for teaching mindfulness, and remembering too, as I've pointed out, that the Buddha did not use the word mindfulness or anything that meant paying attention. That was an English translation, I think in the 19th century, of the original Sanskrit word, which is sati, S-A-T-I, which actually means literally recollection. It means that you remember that you can do something that you don't habitually or automatically do. So, you know, the way that mindfulness is taught is right now is paying attention to the present moment, but actually it was a little different when the Buddha was teaching it, and a little bit different to remember the full Dharma, the framework that you're using to understand all of your experience. So without that, it's called right view, and that is one of the foundational aspects to the Eightfold Path. Without that right view, it's actually easy to distort some of the meanings of mindfulness, and to use them in some ways, you know, you could say for your own self-promotion or your own self-protection. You can use mindfulness as a way to get away from somebody who's relating to you, or you can use sometimes as a way to promote yourself, you know, to advertise yourself even. And again, I'm not saying these things to say that mindfulness in teaching it is a wrong way to do it. Gosh, there are just so many things that are loading into my mind right now. What I mean to say here is I'm not opposed to people offering mindfulness practice outside of the framework of Buddhism. However, I believe that offering it within the framework of Buddhism creates great advantages, great and important advantages that are not there if you teach it outside of that framework. And again, to be really clear here, I am not saying that everyone who teaches it within the framework of Buddhism needs to take refuge. I think it's possible for people to study that framework, to teach mindfulness, to acknowledge this right view without necessarily taking refuge. And yet, if I were to have all of my wishes for all of the world, it wouldn't happen, but I don't. And so I would prefer that people who are teaching mindfulness within a Buddhist framework have taken refuge. So again, there are many, many layers in this. The most important one, the one that I would want you to think about most deeply, is that Buddhism is a different worldview from the worldview that has been embraced in the West typically. And it is a worldview that regards everything to be arising moment to moment in the contact between what we call a subject and an object. And so the real world is not out there, and you're not in here. And I know that I've spent a lot of time teaching about this in the course that I'm doing called Living Together Without Falling Apart. And I've called this the subjective snow globe, in which we create through our senses what we regard as ourselves and the world. So we're always arising in this radically interdependent way that is almost impossible to imagine from the perspective that most of us take in the West. and especially from what I would call the typical materialism of a scientific perspective, that you study objects in science. So I'm loading a lot of things on here, but what I want to say, and I will repeat it as we talk to each other, I want to say that Buddhism wants to change your mind. It wants to change your mind in a fundamental way about what you take to be real. And so if you learn mindfulness and the practice, you can become skilled in keeping track of your thoughts and feelings. You can become skilled in generating more equanimity in your experience. You can really create emotional spaces for yourself in which you are more able to respond with kindness and curiosity to others. But you might not change anything more than that. You might be able to change your attitudes in your relationships, some of your attitudes towards yourself, and that's great. That is really great. That's therapeutic. It's good. But the bigger project you could miss if mindfulness gets separated from the Buddhist teachings. And so the two major things that you would miss are the right view, which is the foundation for everything, actually, and then also the ethical foundation, which is a way of conducting oneself on a regular basis. And the ethical foundation for Buddhist practice also requires quite a long study in order to really engage with it. So missing out on those aspects or not even knowing they're there can sometimes be a part of offering mindfulness in an entirely secular environment and offering it simply as a way of paying attention. So, so before I stop to just open it to a discussion, I just want to say once more, so that this part maybe you won't have to ask me about. I am also supportive of people offering mindfulness in school and mindfulness in prisons and mindfulness for driving your car. I'm supportive of that as a kind of therapeutic measure for people to be able to use some of these skills and to use them from whatever perspective. But then in a slightly more formal way, I would want even the general public to understand that there's much more to it, that mindfulness is not just a separate bubble sort of to be used for whatever without even knowing anything about its beginnings and its foundation. So I think this is a good place to stop and talk about this, because I could probably say things in a way that's more useful to you and helpful to you if I know what you're thinking. So please, you can either ask the question, unmute yourself, or you can ask through typing it to Lori.
Yes, so I do have one question here. If you could explain what you mean by taking refuge.
Taking refuge. Okay. When you enter into the Buddhist community, you actually take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the Buddha here actually is, you take refuge, or you, let's say, take comfort in the fact that a regular human being was enlightened to the degree of cosmic consciousness, that you take refuge in believing that there was such a being, and that such a being actually awakened in this vast way, and you being a human being, you take comfort in that. Then you also take refuge in the Dharma, which there are a lot of ways to define the Dharma, but let's say the natural spiritual laws, that you live within natural spiritual laws, and you take refuge in those, that is in studying them and in embracing them as a part of who you are. And then you take refuge in the Sangha. The Sangha is the community of people that you are practicing with. And these are your spiritual friends. At one point, the Buddha challenged one of his followers, saying, how much of this path do you think is based on friendship? And his disciples said, well, about 50%, about half. And the Buddha said, no, 100%. It's based on friendship. So Buddhism doesn't have like Jerusalem or Rome or Mecca. There's not one single institution that validates it. It's really the warm hand to warm hand. It's person to person. And of course, there are structures and there are communities, and then there are disciplines and so on. But the friendship aspect, the Sangha or the community, is a very big part of what you join into when you join the family of Buddhism. And so each time when you join into Buddhism, as whether you're in Theravadan practice, which is earlier forms of Buddhism, or you're in a Mahayana practice, which includes Zen and a lot of other forms of Buddhism, like the Vipassana forms, of some of the more westernized forms, or the Vajrayana, which is best known in Tibetan Buddhism, and Shingon, that is the form of skillful means for helping all beings succeed in becoming enlightened. So in all of these paths, you take refuge. And one other way of thinking about refuge, I like this, somebody said it to me along the way, is that, often when something goes wrong, we get flustered and we go into our old habits of mind, or we might use an obscenity, or we might use some. Instead, if you can just go to these 3 things that you've taken refuge and you just quickly bring them to mind, there's a comfort in that. And so it's a place to go in your own mind that you can draw strength from. And so those are the refuge vows. And when you get onto the path, you take them. And then you also take these precepts or these intentions to behave and speak in a certain way in order to become yourself in a more complete and engaged way. So I truly am deeply interested in all different kinds of spiritual paths. I just happen to be on this one, but I take a lot from the Christian contemplative practices too. I've met wonderful people on that path. Also, evangelical Christianity. Many of the people in my life grew up in a Jewish tradition. And a very good friend of mine is a Sufi teacher in the Muslim tradition. So I'm truly interested in all of these paths, and I just happen to have this great affinity for this one. But I don't think the paths are that different, but there are also differences that are important.
When you talk about refuge, and you were talking about Jerusalem, Rome, those are physical places, but the word, it's all based on the word of the Bible, the word of the, as Buddhism is, all these are based on the word.
Well,
I guess it was more of a statement than a question.
Okay, so I would say in Buddhism, things are based on practice and also experiences that are validated, that as you move along the path, you go to your teachers and you get tested more or less to see whether you're deceiving yourself, about your insights.
Isn't there a moralistic or ethical path that you're following?
Well, again, with well, let's go back to Jerusalem and Mecca and so on. The reason that I mentioned that, so Rome, Jerusalem, Mecca are places where there are the higher orders from the institutional religions that are represented there. There is not such a center for Buddhism. It is not, even when the Dalai Lama was located in the Potala, that was really only just one center, because at the same time there were different centers for the Chinese forms, for the Japanese forms, for the South Asian forms. So there's not one center where things are adjudicated from one place. And in that way, Buddhism doesn't have the authority, the sort of institutional structure of a lot of the other institutional religions. On the other hand, there are practices, and those practices go back to the time of the Buddha, but of course were not recorded in words on paper, and it wasn't paper anyway, but they weren't written down until about 454 years after the Buddha died. So it was an oral tradition at the beginning. So Buddhism actually comes out of an oral tradition that was repeated and memorized by monks for a long time before anything was written down. So are there moral precepts that you follow? Yes, there are, but they're stated in a slightly different form than the Ten Commandments. I'll try to give it to you in a kind of a quick version. They are essentially guidelines for good character. And if you want to become a person of good character, you willingly embrace these guidelines. It's not like there's any kind of superior power judging you, but you are embracing these guidelines because you want to become a person of good character. Also, they're stated differently, and they're stated differently in different traditions, but originally they're stated like this: I vow to take the training not to kill. So that vow does not say, I promise not to kill. It says, I vow to take the training not to kill, because there was a recognition that in order to live, we also have to eat other things and other beings. So it's a conundrum when you take the training not to kill. But you keep investigating it through your life. What does it mean? How can you be? How are you with others that you may eat, other animals or insects or plants or whatever? So when you vow to take that to take that training, you vow to keep that inquiry open and to actually function with that big question in front of you. So it's very different than a commandment not to kill. I vow to take the training not to lie. When you look deeply into it, everybody lies. Everybody lies, little white lies, little some lies. Well, what does it mean then to vow not to lie? Well, you take a training and you gradually recognize how you deceive yourself, how you talk to yourself, how you talk to others. It becomes interesting as you move along. So it's really very different than the Ten Commandments in that way. So I hope that's clear. Whoever asked the question about institutions, it's a different approach than Rome or Mecca. So there are other questions out there, I hear.
Yes. So let's see. How does a simple householder find a guru, a sangha? Where do you start? It's hard to know where to even begin.
Okay, so that's a really easy question. I would say you could start on the internet, because that's where everything is now. That's where I am too, it seems. But so if you want to start at any level, if you want to start simply a mindfulness practice, there are many resources for that. And simple ones are like Headspace or Unified Mindfulness, or there are others. I don't know them all, but really easy to find. Then if you decide, yes, I'm interested in Buddhism, just beyond mindfulness even, then look around in your area where you live. Look at the internet. You will find that there are different Buddhist centers in your area. And, you know, if we weren't in this lockdown, they would have regular practices that you could attend in person. Now they have online practices, so I don't know how people begin those practices, but I'm sure that they are friendly in wanting to welcome you in. So everywhere now in the U.S., there are Buddhist practice centers close by. And so what I used to advise is go to an event, go to a practice, go to something and see what you think and see what the people are like and see what the teacher there is like. Most places have teachers, some places have visiting teachers. And then if you continue to be interested, I would say meet with some group or center that you choose. Meet with them regularly so you get to know the people. Because again, the friendship basis, the Sangha, the community is 100%. You want to find others that you can speak with in that setting. And since there are so many settings to choose from now, I think that just beginning in your area and finding something, as you get into Buddhist practice, it's you know, as my first teacher said, it's like the ocean. You know, you get in, it seems like it's shallow, you can get out there, and then the deeper you go, the deeper it gets. I mean, the further you go, the deeper it gets. And so as you move on in practicing, then you might want to really, you know, investigate a particular form of Buddhism that has been existing, you know, for a long time. So, but I think at the very beginning, when you're just a regular person, I'm a regular person too, you know, it's a good idea to go on the internet and find out what's around you and then go meet with some of those people. And you know, I know different places have different levels of lockdown right now. Here where I live in Vermont, it's still really not possible to go into most of the centers, but it might be in a month from now. So I hope that's a good answer.
I have a question.
Yes.
Oh, okay. My name's Nina. I'm tuning in from Rowe. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is like too off track, but I thought it was interesting how in the beginning you mentioned like how mindfulness, like that word itself, wasn't necessarily part of Buddhism, but it's kind of like become an offshoot, and how it's like useful therapeutically, but also can be used, I don't know, in some less, I don't know, in different ways. And I just wanted to share my experience is that I feel like I've become like oversaturated with like hearing about mindfulness all the time. Like mindfulness, that it helps your productivity, it's good for your mental health, blah, blah, blah. Like you should meditate, do mindfulness, and it just like honestly like makes me want to do it less. And like I've done like cognitive behavioral therapy for years with a therapist. So I feel like pretty solid in my understanding of mindfulness, but yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that, you know, mindfulness is not necessarily, it's not like mindfulness equals Buddhism, because for a while I thought like, oh, I couldn't like Buddhism because I'm so tired of hearing about mindfulness all the time. You know what I mean? Yes. I don't know if you have anything to say about that. It's not really like a question, but I just wanted to share that.
Well, I think it's a really good observation. I've had some of the same impression about mindfulness. I also feel like you know, it became so sort of commercialized or popularized or something that you know, it was like I also wanted to stop subscribing because it was just kind of overdone. Now, on the other hand, I don't feel that way about Buddhism at all. Not at all, not in the slightest. It's the sort of most important informative framework for everything I do moment to moment, but it's alive. It's not a scripture. It's not a particular kind of thing. It's a certain kind of inquiry about my experience that has been generated by going into what I would call a deep study of what it means to be here on earth. Like, what is going on here? You know, we know that things don't work out well here. And what's the deal? So for me, it's been a very practical engagement with bigger questions about the meaning of what my life is, what your life is, what's going on here. Now, mindfulness is, of course, primarily the offshoot of various Buddhist groups in the West. I was going to say of various Buddhist magazines in the West, but probably that's not fair. But the idea was, and I think, again, it's a valuable idea, was to take at least the kind of basic framework for paying attention to your experience and take that into schools, into prisons, and other places to help people just be able to pause and actually be open to things that they typically are just jumping over because they're defending themselves, or because they are in pain, or because they're drowning in some idea that they have. So mindfulness was, I think, brought out as a set of practices to help. But then, you know, what happened to it in America, I would say what happens to everything in North America is that it gets commercialized. I mean, it seems like that's what we are as a culture. You know, you come, anything that you bring to America, we'll commercialize it for you, you know, and then you can sell it, and then it becomes part of what seems to be a materialistic culture, always, you know, about how you can improve yourself. So I think that mindfulness did take on this flavor as a result of being offered so that people could find some skills to work with their own minds, but then it sort of jumped out of its Buddhist garb and jumped into its American garb. So it started, you know, being sort of more like popular culture or apps and ways of just self-improvement. So I think we're at a point where something's going to change in that regard. My hope is that mindfulness does not become just a commercial product, but actually somehow joins back to its roots in the teachings of what's called the Buddha Dharma, which is simply the ways that Buddhism looks at our experiences, because those ways of looking are really, really different from a materialist view of the world. And materialism, by materialism, I mean everything from believing that, you know, eating kale and getting a mammogram will save you, to believing that, you know, making lots of money and owning lots of stocks will save you, to believing that all of the Western sciences will save you. Those are all materialism. They all are based in the ideas of matter, and matter somehow being more real than anything else, and that if you get to the roots of matter and you know how to use it, that's going to save you. And in a certain way, you know, if you trace all of that back, it goes kind of back to the Greeks and the idea of an atom. And it was a good idea. The idea that you could find something that's eternal in the material world. But it turned out to be wrong. It was a mistake. But it's been hard for us to wake up to that mistake. So, I hope that mindfulness can get back connected to Buddhism, and that it will in some way then help us turn the world upside down and, stop trying to save ourselves through materialism. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but it's what I would like. Are there other questions?
This is Anna. I'm in Seattle. I appreciated what Nina brought up, and then your discussion, Polly, about the materialism and the, commodifying and all of that. One of the interesting things that I feel like I'm observing in the Buddhist communities I'm involved in is now an emphasis on ethics, interestingly, and you brought that up at the very beginning.
Yes.
And I appreciate, all of the Eightfold Path, but I'm thinking about the whole thing of going back to right view, right understanding, that often these conversations about justice and climate and certainly our political situation, all again, very important, but I'm thinking about the basic understanding or view of dependent arising and conditionality. And to me, that I'm fearing is getting lost.
I agree.
And that's the idea
of
awakening in the way that I understanding is going by the wayside in our efforts to be ethical human beings now. So, but anyway,
I agree with all that you're saying. I think you're exactly, from my perspective, you're on the target of why I was even offering this conversation today. And when I began to feel really strongly that way was at that Summer Research Institute.
I wondered.
Yeah. And I felt like this is just politics.
Mm-hmm.
And
certainly all of the indiscretions of our Buddhist teachers have brought it to light. We all wanted to address that.
Right. That's really a slightly different topic, though, than the topics that were coming up in the conversations about social justice and, the sort of calling out of people's faults and so on. There's a very different perspective that when you have right view and right understanding, you're arising moment to moment with the beings that are with you. And so how are you going to handle that particular, whatever place you are in? How are you going to handle that moment, those relationships, with compassion, with equanimity, and also with the understanding that you're not separate from them?
Yeah.
And that requires a whole different mindset than what we've typically brought to the idea of justice in the West. So that, I would like to see us have a much, much bigger conversation in the Buddhist world about these topics, because we have a different view. So thank you for saying that.
So there's another question here, sort of around Christian. Would it be heresy to consider a Christian-rooted mindfulness?
No, not at all. There have been a lot of Christian-rooted mindfulness, and I've participated in a number of retreats in Catholic churches and particularly Zen retreats. There are a lot of Catholic Zen people, particularly in Europe, in Spain, in the Netherlands. In fact, I went to a retreat in the Netherlands that was hosted by monks, Christian monks, and they had several of them had trained in Kyoto in Japan, So there's a tradition, not just of the Buddhist Christian dialogue, which was something that was started by Masao Abe, who was at Columbia University in the 60s and 70s, but also of especially Catholic priests and monastics taking Buddhist training and taking the refuge and so on. Buddhism is not opposed to any religion, and actually respects every path. And you can practice in some Buddhist communities both a path of another religion and Buddhism. His Holiness the Dalai Lama did make one comment once that I thought was really good, which is not to mix them up. He said something like this. He said, you know, he likes a French cuisine and he likes Chinese cuisine, but he wouldn't want to mix them in one meal. It's just they don't go together. And so again, the way that you practice, you practice certain kinds of things under certain circumstances and certain other ones under others. And many of the Christian contemplatives particularly practice Buddhism. Now, a lot of my Buddhist teachers and the people that I know as Buddhist teachers are Jewish people, and they've gone on practicing Judaism. And Sylvia Boorstein is one of the well-known ones, and she wrote a book early on that was titled, You Don't Look Buddhist, because she was a very strong Jewish lady, and she didn't look Buddhist. So there's a lot of mixing of people's traditions and backgrounds. So yes, no problem with that. Now, some teachers would say that they would not want to mix, and others say yes, but it's not against the teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha was very clear. In some ways, one of my teachers said, the reason you don't become a Buddhist is that you already are one. I mean, if you consider the actual teachings are about reality as a human being on earth. So you're already there. You're already in it. And what the Dharma is about is just the way you pay attention and where you locate yourself in it, what kinds of things you do and say, and what the results of those are. And so the Buddha Dharma really is orienting yourself within the pragmatics of this life. It's not a salvation kind of religion. So I gave a lot of different answers to that. But what is there another question then?
What are the dangers of using mindfulness and equanimity to fully understand someone else's point of view outside the purview of Buddhist practice?
The dangers of trying to understand another's point of view outside of the purview of Buddhist practice, is that what you said?
This is from Alan Coulter, so maybe he can chime in and if you want a little more explanation on that question.
Yeah.
Alan, are you there?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking if somebody was trying to truly practice real dialogue to understand someone else's point of view, and that was really all they were doing, as difficult as that is, they would be using mindfulness and equanimity in that skill.
Yeah.
Are there dangers of doing that and not being a Buddhist?
Well, no, I don't think, no. I wouldn't be teaching it like I teach it if I thought there were inherent dangers. So let me say this. There's always a danger in doing anything, and the danger is self-deception, right? That you think you're doing one thing, it turns out you really weren't doing that. So there's always the danger of self-deception when you develop any kind of skill that you want to practice with other people. There's no other danger. I mean, I'm not saying in any way that learning these skills outside of Buddhism is wrong or bad or leads to something bad. I am saying that sort of divorcing these things from a Buddhist foundation. You'll notice when I teach real dialogue, I am teaching Buddhist foundations all over the place, and everything I do, I'm going back to the worldview. I might not say it, but I am going back to the basic foundations of teaching. And one reason why I feel confident about offering real dialogue as mindfulness practice is I know I'm building in all sorts of things that are going to change your view of what is happening, and they're changing your view towards a dharmic view. And of course, I often in teaching, quote things from my teachers, talk about what the Buddha taught, go back to the teachings themselves from the Buddha. So I do that because I want Buddhism to be the foundation of real dialogue, but I don't care whether anybody learns it as a Buddhist or practices that. It would be great if everybody wanted to do that, but there are all sorts of people and people want to do all sorts of things. So it's fine to practice it out of context of anything else other than the actual practice of real dialogue, which has a lot of the Buddha Dharma built into it, believe it or not. It's like a car with a lot under the hood. It looks one way here, it looks another way, from another direction. But then, of course, the problem of doing anything is that you have to be checked by somebody. But if you have a partner in life, you can be checked by your partner. Your partner will let you know whether you're making sense or not. And then if you don't have a partner, it'd be good to find someone to check with. I mean, that's, again, something nice about Buddhism. You check with your teachers. They tell you whether you're actually doing it or not, So, yes, it was a good question, but real dialogue and a lot of the mindfulness practices, they can be used in a skillful way without knowing the whole thing. I just would prefer that mindfulness itself not be completely divorced from the foundations of Buddhism. Just my preference.
Sure. Thank you.
If you cannot take refuge, how would you practice outside of refuge in a way that is respectful to the Buddhist tradition?
Well, again, I hope people aren't hearing me as saying that you have to do all these things. I mean, so taking refuge is a serious step, and you're going to take a lot of steps before that, I hope. So the first step would be look at the internet, find a place that's close by that looks interesting to you, or just use an app to get started. If it seems like you really like this and you're interested and it clicks, then take a next step. So taking refuge is more like, it's like the serious step through the door of really promising to remain engaged. And I think that comes at the point where you can take the serious step. It's like when people come to psychotherapy, they usually don't come to see me either in couples therapy or for individual therapy as the first thought they have about how to change their lives. They usually try all sorts of other things first. And then, they finally come to, oh, maybe I want to do a serious psychotherapy where I kind of, learn about myself. So when they walk through my door, I assume they've already made a lot of other steps. And when they consent to do the therapy that we're going to do together, I assume they've already considered lots of other alternatives. And I would say the same thing is true about taking refuge. Take some baby steps, see if you like it. Then take more steps. And if you like that, and particularly if there's some kind of community around you, then consider the next steps. So, you can do all of that with tremendous respect for everything the Buddha taught, because you know, you're already in the world, you're already a human being, you already actually achieved a lot. So, you know, you can then take the steps towards finding out whether the path, the actual path of Buddhism suits you, fits with the way you see things. And I would do that first, by trying to find some other people that are practicing, or just try an app, you know, to get started. So anything else? Or you could try Real Dialogue also, because we do have a course online for Real Dialogue, and it's a way of learning mindfulness practice through relationship. And it is not based fundamentally on meditation, although there are some practices in terms of just sharpening up your ability to hear yourself and to be in contact with yourself.
So I see a raised hand. Margot Parker has her hand raised, and I was just about to ask your question, Margot, so maybe you can go ahead and speak.
I hope I can get this out right, because this was a seed that was planted in my head by someone I respect, who made a comment, and does know about Buddhism, but made a comment that she felt that she could no longer embrace it because she felt that it wasn't, the word isn't honoring women, but somehow there was some kind of, not even a prejudice. I'm not finding the word. But I thought I just had to put it out there, because like I said, I had never thought that until she planted that seed, and this is somebody that I respect. So I couldn't blow it up. So,
well, it's a big question. So I wrote a book called Women and Desire, Beyond Wanting to be Wanted. And that book came out, I think, in maybe 97. I honestly can't remember anymore. But in the book is a chapter on women in relation to the world's religions. And there is not a religion where women were welcomed as teachers among the formal religions. You know, there may be Native American religions, but by and large, women have had a difficult time with any religion that has been codified and formalized, including Buddhism. And although originally the Buddha did reluctantly welcome what was essentially his ex-wife, you could say, the wife that he walked away from, and also his mother, who was not actually his birth mother. His birth mother died in his childbirth, and then he was raised by his aunt, or at least these are the stories. Even though he reluctantly welcomed them as his followers, not too long later, I don't remember whether it was 100 years or more than that, women were not regarded on an equal par with men in the monastic communities. There have just been a lot of problems over time in relation to the formal aspects of Buddhism. And since we do have a woman who is a teacher online, I don't know if she's willing to speak, but I'm going to ask if you are, Echo. But you know, it's a long path. But it's been a long path in every one of the big world religions. Are you willing to say anything about that?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I have been ordained in the Japanese Vajrayana lineage, Shingon, for nearly 30 years now, and have had a very intense growth curve, if you will, in learning about how women have been viewed in traditional Buddhist institutional frameworks, if you will. And so it's been quite extraordinary, because I came to the Dharma as a Westerner, certainly very, very inspired by the presentation of initially the Zen tradition, and a belief that women were fundamentally, equal and equal in capacity on the path, and that is what indeed I was taught by my first teachers. But after 7 years of training and life in the Japanese, a very traditional Japanese cultural context, the attitudes towards women in that cultural context that had certainly pervaded how the Dharma was transmitted were abundantly apparent. And so initially, as I was looking towards female mentors in Japan, these are Japanese female priests, nuns, they had lived lives of oppression and struggle within those dharmic institutions, and that greatly limited their capacity to freely practice the Dharma. And so that was a very profound encounter, if you will, in terms of having to look at my own Western values and beliefs and just my beingness and what's really going on here in this encounter of these teachings that are focused on helping us to see our own minds, and then the ethical implications of institutionalized discrimination ongoing. So it's been a long path. I returned to the United States and have been intending to teach in a progressive manner, progressive in the context of traditional forms, if you will. So anyway, so these issues are very serious, and I can understand the reaction, if you will, or the position that women often come to in feeling just a need to separate from the institutions. The good thing about our religious life and structures in America is that we do have true freedom of religion here. And we can find community and create community. And this has had a profound effect and is, as Polly mentioned, returning to Asia. And yes, the Asians are paying attention now. And this is very important. And this is thanks to the deep practice and effort of many females who have simply not given up yes, and persevered in their practice. And with a deep faith that as human beings, we all have Buddha nature and the capacity to awaken. So the great gift that Western culture will give to the Buddha Dharma is precisely what we are engaged in now, here in the West, and in these confluences of different Western systems of thought, psychology, and this confluence and how psychology is informing Buddha Dharma is greatly contributing to it. And the Asian Buddhist teachers who come here to the West and deeply try to connect with the level of suffering, our concerns, our psychological concerns, where we are stuck in this whole process, and have the great compassion to truly understand where we are and begin to voice the teachings in ultimately very progressive ways, is indeed another great contribution that we're providing. We're providing a container that is informed by democratic structures, certain legal protections that we have. So it's a very long, complex, and intricate issues, and it does exist. So this is where ethics really need to be deeply engaged, and really re-informed. So, for example, in the Tibetan Vajrayana, as their basic foundational Mahayana precepts developed and expanded, there's actually a precept where males are forbidden to disparage females. Is where that Dharma came to in the development of looking at this perceived difference and what are they going to do to address it. So even if certain males may hold certain sort of discriminatory attitudes towards females, they were literally forbidden to voice it, or that was their practice training. So, and very important. And so that, that's just an example of kind of the process, and the process has continued and in a very slow way in Asia, but is speeding up now thanks to the questioning of Westerners who are coming to Asia to ask questions and to be in these different frameworks, forever changing them and helping them to evolve. And likewise, we are, beneficent of this spiritual evolution.
Thank you so much for saying that. I know that we're just about out of time, Echo. It was just lovely to hear you actually articulate such a big framework, because maybe I should have a class just on the topic of,
I think so, yeah,
of women, because actually there are so many levels. There are levels in all of the things that people have asked, but I think, again, trying to bring this back to the framework of Buddhism versus just mindfulness cut off from the Buddhist foundations. The important thing is going back to the bigger framework of the Dharma from the point of view of deep lessons about reality. And actually, as women enter into that conversation, we're a part of reality. It has to come in. And it has to come in a way that is really thoughtful if we keep it within the framework of the larger project of the Dharma. So I know that we have to stop the class, and I want to say goodbye and thank you to everybody. And thank you for being in it. And please join us again. And Lori's going to make some short announcements. And again, thank you so much, Echo Noble.
Yes, just a quick reminder to everyone, we're continuing this Saturday at 11 o'clock Eastern, the series Living Together Without Falling Apart. We're in session 7 called Listening Mindfully. And all of the other sessions can be viewed on Polly's website at Young-Eisendrath.com. And this series continues at this same time next Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And that's entitled The Human Self is Interactive, What Does That Mean? And both of these classes are presented in partnership with the Rowe Center, so we hope to see you there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.